Hi people, and welcome back to my history ramblings, or just attempting to teach you guys a course syllabus of the IB of the International Baccalaureate, as well overlapping with IGCSE. So yesterday or before we talked about the causes of the First World War. So today we're going to go through the course and hopefully the nature of the First World War, because you have to understand how the climate, how the political, battlefield and social climate was during that time period, in order to understand why it formed the basis for future conflicts and future social disruptions to come. Again, I'm not a qualified, I'm not a teacher, let's put it this way. I'm not like a qualified teacher, but I can do the best I can to teach you with the notes that we have made. So again, if I miss something out, it's probably because I was tired and making these notes late at night, but otherwise I've tried to put as much detail as I can. So let's go through it, shall we? So there's my mouse. Here, drink of water. Okay, so the image of the First World War, when people think about the First World War, we think about trench fighting in Belgium and France and Flanders, and minimal gains with war of attrition and stalemates and trench warfare. You have a pretty good picture if you watch like films like Passchendaele or Warhorse, because they show a pretty accurate description of basically what life in the mud and the fields of France were like at the time. Again, and surprisingly, a fun fact is that artillery fire accounted for most of, despite those conditions, artillery fire accounted for over 70% of casualties during the war, not as what people might think, like machine guns or rifle fire. So let's start to go through a little bit. So yes, here we go. So first of all, Eastern Europe was with Russia, and then vs Austria and Germany, because the Slavs were against the other Central Powers. The Austro-Italian border was formed after Italy joined in 15, because Italy was neutral in the first part of the war. Then they just decided to join the Entente. And the Balkans with, well, it's a whole mess, as you can see here. And the Ottoman Empire, as I talked about yesterday, the Ottoman Empire was pretty powerful, but it was still in a decline. But it controlled most of the Middle East, and most importantly oil, where the Brits wanted to get oil and whatever with the Suez Canal and stuff. So the Turkish people faced the Brits and imperial troops and Commonwealth troops and empire troops at Gallipoli, Mesopotamia and the Middle East. As if you've played Battlefield 1, Oil of Empires, yeah, the Suez Canal and our Suez maps, and yeah, Foul Fortress, yeah. So there was also a bit in Africa, but because the Germans wanted to take the Brits, but then the Brits were like no, so the Brits attacked the German colonies. And the war on the Western Front, like it's not late 1914 to late 1914 to mid 1917, was pretty much a stalemate. It was a stalemate after the race to the sea in the beginning failed, and everybody got bogged down and decided that digging down was the best way to hide from rifle and artillery fire. And 1917 wasn't a stalemate in the latter half, because the Americans joined the war, and mass mobilizations and improvements in technology and armored warfare allowed them to basically overcome the stalemates of being dug in. So they just pushed forward. As we see in the following point, there was a war move in the opening months and from the spring of 1918, however. This proves my point, because spring offensive, the 100 Days offense, the Americans with their literally over 1 million fresh men, rejuvenated men, replacing or bolstering the already tired and battered British and French forces. And yeah, the Russians pulled out of the war, unfortunately, earlier. So let's go back to the beginning a little bit, as we see the Germans sought to knock out France in 6 weeks, because the Germans, because the Schlieffen plan, because they wanted to knock out France first before going to deal with slow mobilization Russia, but it didn't really work, because the Schlieffen plan worked a bit too well. They went too far from the railheads, and then supplies couldn't go forward, and everything went wrong. Germany deployed 7 armies against France, and one was positioned in the Eastern Front to deal with any Russian attack, because although the Russians are mobilizing, they could have a couple of units that are faster and then come up to the front. So Germany had a pretty large army at the time, like over 2 million, so it could afford to put the most of its force to the Schlieffen Plan. And when it says armies, you may think, oh, isn't the German army like only one unit? Nope, there's several different military units from the lowest to the highest. It goes from, I used the British one, but the Americans and Commonwealth should be similar. It goes from section up to platoon, then to company, then to regiment, then to company, battalion, regiment, and then goes to brigade. Brigade goes to corps. Corps goes to brigade, and then division, and then corps, and then field army, corps, and then army, and then theater of war. So it was a pretty high. It was army. The Germans called their armies Army Group 1 through I don't know how much. Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, and they were pretty much commanded by old Prussian educated and Prussian trained generals. So it was a pretty efficient army. As you can see, France was going to have a difficult time because you're going up against people who are professional officers, a professionally led army, as opposed to Britain's professionally trained army, as per the officer class. But anyway, so only when France was defeated in the Schlieffen Plan would Germany turn around and focus on Russia, as I've said. And as soon as war broke out, the French implemented Plan 17, which was to get back Alsace-Lorraine because they kind of lost it in the Franco-Prussian Wars, as I've explained yesterday. And meanwhile, the Brits had the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, of Mons and Marne fame, and then they dispatched it to help. It wasn't supposed to fight back the German invasion, but they were tasked to hold the line because Britain's army, the British Expeditionary Force, was formed up by elite and hand-picked units of various elements of the existing armed forces, land armed forces. They were quite small, only about 2 divisions, and or was it 2 corps? I don't remember. Crap. Anyway, they were quite very small compared to the conscript armies of France and Germany. The British Expeditionary Force was the only voluntary and professional army, and it only had something like about 80,000 at the time or something. It's very small. So they couldn't hold much, but they could do their best to hold the line, as we learned in Mons. Later down here at the casualties of Mons. I'll talk about that in a bit. I actually did my EE on this, so it's quite nice. And in the east, going back in the east, Russia began mobilizing, blah blah blah. Austria-Hungary's main focus was Serbia because, the July crisis. The German commander-in-chief was Helmut von Moltke, Count Moltke. So he was the guy that modified the Schlieffen Plan to go through go through Belgium instead of go through Holland. So he was a very sneaky guy. As you see, he changed the Schlieffen Plan, more troops to the Eastern Front, positioned more troops on the left wing rather than the right, so going through Belgium instead of Holland. And in August 1914, the Germans went through Luxembourg, Belgium, and France with 1.5 and 1.7 million troops. However, as I've said, the German advance was slower than anticipated because they had issues with their supply and logistics because they went too fast. So they had to slow down and they had to kind of fix up the mess while still trying to push forward a home advantage, but it didn't really work. It wasn't 80,000, 120,000 BF soldiers arrived in France sooner than anticipated. It was divided up into two different divisions, 2 different corps. I can't bloody remember, but 2 divisions I think. But was it corps? Because division major general. Anyway, so they arrived in France sooner. On the 23rd was Mons. 23rd of August was Mons. So anyway, they arrived in France sooner because. It's literally just across the channel, so they just got bogged over, and then they went up to help hold the line in Belgium. So Plan 17 for the Belgian resistance more resolute than the Germans because you are going through the home country. They aren't pleased. And the fact that the Belgians also had a small but pretty professional, but not as professional as the Brits. It wasn't voluntary, but it's still pretty effective, and they have nice uniforms, I will say. Plan 17 unfortunately resulted in huge casualties for France because the first month already 210,000 Frenchmen were lost because you're kind of trying to get back what the Germans already kind of have, and you have to go through, they're pushing and you're pushing back, but you have an even more well-equipped and even more how should I say, just just the odds were in favor of the German steamroller just coming over to France. The French were held up by the Germans at the Battle of Frontier, then driven back, and then in early September the Germans really came close to Paris. But then the northernmost army groups, they swung east rather than west, so it went east is this. So they went backwards a little bit. So yeah, it exposed the German troops quite a lot. So the Allied forces, the Entente forces, could pour in fire from north to south. I think, I don't remember. Then the French and British had flanked and attacked behind and inflicted loss at the Battle of the Marne. First Marne, I think it was 14. The Germans pulled away from Paris back to the Aisne, and then the Volt Mocha resigned and then replaced by this guy that you will very know well. If you watch Dan Carlin's history, or he keeps mentioning Falkenhayn a lot, but you should remember him. The Germans and the Brits and the French tried to outflank each other, thus it's the race to the sea. Because if you imagine Europe as a big, if you look at a map, they were heading, they had clashed right in the middle of Europe technically, because France is sandwiched between the sea, and sandwiched between Spain and at the bottom. So they had clashed and they were trying to outflank each other. So what they mean was that one force would push into a certain point, the other force would try to go around and flank around to kind of cut off the invading force. But then the other force would try to outflank and cut off each other. Let's put it this way: cut off each other. So they kind of went north all the way, and thus it was called the race to the sea. And then yeah, they arrived at the Channel. So yeah, they dug in, and then it was trench warfare. But as before that, we see at the Battle of Ypres, it's not wipers as the British troops pronounced it at the time, it's Ypres. The Brits and the French prevented the Germans from capturing it and outflanking them. And because they ran out of room, so there was nowhere to advance, and literally there was a couple 100-mile long front. So trench lines were formed, and Ypres became a salient. A salient is when a line juts out in front. You can think of it as like a straight line, and then you suddenly put a semicircle on it. It's a good position for pouring fire because you have a wide view and you have a wide angle. Unfortunately, it is also a very bad position to receive fire because that means the enemy has more of you to shoot. You're jutting out. Hence, in World War II, Battle of the Bulge, the Germans got trashed so hard by the Americans in the Ardennes. But anyway, let's go back 30 years to the First World War. Well, anyway, it's actually 30 years war. Battle of Bulge was 44 and this is 91. Yeah, 30. Anyway, I'm rambling again. So the Germans controlled the high ground, aka the salient, and was it? No, this geographically. And ignore me. By the end of 1914, the Brits had lost 96,000 men and the French nearly a million, 995. While the German, what is it? Million? Oh yeah, the German casualties totaling 670,000. The reason why French casualties were so high is that the French were patriotic and willing to die for their country. It wasn't the first time the Germans had invaded, and it wouldn't be the last, given 30 years later, but the French were not they didn't have the professional, esteemed, well-trained officer class of the Germans, so it was kind of a sad thing that many Frenchmen got massacred trying to hold the line against the Germans. Thankfully, the Russians under Tsar Nicholas II mobilized faster than Schlieffen and von Moltke had anticipated, so they managed to put pressure on the Germans, aka Tannenberg, but the Germans trashed them hard. Moltke transferred 60,000 German troops from the west into the eastern front, so that means he could relieve pressure because it was a stalemate. So he could afford to take some of his men back and bolster the line on the bolster the front on the opposite side. Hindenburg, Paul von Hindenburg, you should know him, he's vital for later history. And Ludendorff controlled Germany's forces in the east, aka the Eastern Front. And as I've said, German forces overwhelmed the Russians at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in September. Because, again, the Russians were kind of crap as an army. The officers were okay, but the conscripts were really... Even on between conscripts, they sucked compared to the Germans. But they had more men. But anyway, they just got overwhelmed. And also because the Russians, they just of lower quality at the time. So they fatally transmitted uncoded messages, telegraphing the messages to Germany, which was... stupid, but okay. So the German army at this time was having a war on two fronts, because you have the Allies pushing in from the east, the Entente pushing in from the east, trying to gain back as much of France as possible, and you've got the Russians pushing in from the Entente on the west and the Russians pushing in from the east. War on two fronts. So the Germans had to hold the line and fight a defensive war. History in battle, from what I know, battles usually favor the defensive, because when you're in a defensive position, how much men does not matter. Actually, if you're in a defensive position, you have an advantage where you are dug in and you already have positions well fortified and well built positions to defend. As Voltaire once said, God is not on the side of the big battalions, but as Sharp continued in the Sharp series, he is on the side of those who shoot well. So the Germans, they had of course less men than the Entente combined, so they had to single-handedly fight a war on two fronts, and they managed to hold it off for quite a long time, for a couple of years, which was impressive. So it shows how important the Germans were fighting a defensive war. They had decided to focus on Russia because no matter how, Russia had a lot of men. And if we move on, the only significant German offensive on the Western Front was 15 at the Second Battle of Ypres, where they began using gas warfare, chlorine gas. Gas warfare is a hindrance and a blessing. It's a blessing if you can hit the enemy, but it's a hindrance if the wind blows back and chokes your own men instead. So, because the first time gas was used, everybody was panicking, so the Germans captured high ground in the north of Ypres, although Ypres was still mostly controlled by the Allies. And over the course of these few years, there were many French and British offensives, but they had very casualties. As you go over the top, aka out of the trenches, walk across no man's land, and get cut down by machine gun fire or artillery fire. It was a very bad war of attrition. For example, at the Battle of Loos, the Brits used poison gas, but the attack failed because, the reserves had been held back too far, so the second line could not come up fast enough, and by the time they arrived, the first line had already been massacred by the Germans. They couldn't take the advantage. The Brits suffered 50,000 casualties, and French, oh god, Sir John French was replaced by Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig. You may know him from names such as Butcher of the Somme, but that is a Blackaderian type of view of history thanks to the Blackadder Goes 4th series. Douglas Haig was a competent commander, but he was rough-handed in some of his ways. But you can't deny he was the Butcher of the Somme in a way. Anyway, moving on. In May 1915, a huge German offensive against the Russian Northwest Front, which drove them out of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So the Russians lost their advantage in the northern areas, and the Germans managed to secure basically their route to the sea, the Polish corridor and all that stuff to the North Sea. If you go back to Russia, Brusilov felt obliged to withdraw Russian troops in the southwest front as well, because the Russians got trashed by the Germans at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. Then they just got trashed in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So the Russian generals decided it was time to fight their own war of own defense, because you've just had a lot of men killed. It's best to go back and regroup before trying again. Unfortunately, because of this, they couldn't. During the confusion and retreating, 1 million Russians surrendered to the Germans in 1915. Then, in August 1915, the bloody Tsar Nicholas took over as commander-in-chief. And unfortunately, nobody really liked the Tsar, because you were poor, very poor conscript soldiers fighting for a lost cause, basically. In 1915, there was a huge debate amongst the French and the Brits whether they should focus their attention on driving Germany out of France and Belgium, or whether they should knock out the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and the Austro-Hungarians, which were weaker. And here's where we come to Churchill. The Gallipoli Campaign was a massacre for the Australians and the Anzacs and the Middlesex Regiment and other British troops. Churchill thought it would be a good idea to secure the route up the Dardanelles Strait to let the Russians have a supply line, as well as knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Unfortunately, when they went up the straits, Churchill thought that the coastal forts were not of much hindrance to the British Royal Navy, but unfortunately the coastal guns were of pretty sufficient caliber, and they were sending second-line ships. They were sending the older pre-dreadnoughts. And furthermore, the Ottomans were well entrenched in their positions, so when the Anzacs landed, everybody went to hell, because again, it's one of the first proper amphibious invasions, and just like Normandy, nearly 30 years later, having many people in pillboxes and trenches firing machine guns and accurate rifle fire from fortified positions against a bunch of people landing from a ship clumped together on the beach is not going to be well for the invaders. So it was from this campaign that the Anzacs forged their own identity. Gallipoli means a lot to the Australians and New Zealanders because it was through fire, blood and trial by fire that they managed to fight as an independent force, and they fought well under their own identity, suffering one of the heaviest casualties, I think like 500,000 men or something. It was a total slaughter for them, but it's well remembered in Australian history. They have Anzac Day, Gallipoli Day or something. So as we see, in 1915, 18 Allied ships tried to enter the Dardanelles Strait. 4 sank, and I believe some of them hit mines or something. The invasion was abandoned, and then they pulled back, and then Churchill was sacked. Yeah, they pinned down and remained there for a year, and they were only evacuated by early 1916, which is very sad. So yeah, Italy went from neutral to join the Allies after signing the Treaty of London in 1915. Then in the Balkans, the Bulgarians joined the Central Powers and helped Austria-Hungary and Germany defeat Serbia. And then more of Europe was being grabbed by the Central Powers. Britain and France landed neutral Greece to help Greece, but pushed back by the Bulgarians. Greece remained neutral until 17 when it joined the Entente. And basically at this point in the war, mid-war 15 to 16, the Allies were trying to not fight 100% of the time, but also try to get to grips with the environment and try to secure what they can and to regroup and form a new line of offensives and try to put a couple of put pressure on this front or that front. It was a time of reorganization, a time of minor offensives, but also a time of major offensives when the time required it. And it was basically at this time we were fighting a war of supplies, a war of logistics, who could last the longest. And as we see, the war of supplies were going quite badly for Britain because Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare because Germany was convinced that there was no choice because the Americans were coming and the Russian collapse was imminent and they could afford to take an offensive and push home to the west. So as we can see, the German government were well aware that unrestricted submarine warfare would also sink American ships, and America was neutral at the time. And then the Zimmermann telegram happened, in which Germany tried to bribe or trying to seduce Mexico into joining the Central Powers to fight back against the USA, to take back what land the USA had got from it, like New Mexico and Texas and whatnot. And of course the US was pissed off on this, and they declared war on Germany, and also because of the sinking of the Lusitania earlier. So with the US now confirmed joining the war, and over 1 million men projected to actually come and fight on the Western Front, along with fresh equipment, fresh troops, fresh everything, the Germans knew they were running out of luck, so unrestricted submarine warfare, and they just had to put an all-out offensive, as we learned from the 100 Days Offensive later in 1918, and the other small but desperate campaigns and the development of stormtroops throughout the course of the last years of the war. We know that Germany was getting desperate. But however, back on the Entente side, things were not that good, because in April, serious mutinies broke out amongst French units, which meant that the French were not able to launch any more successful offensive for the rest of 1917. They launched mutinies because the soldiers were being slaughtered every day. They saw their dying comrades, and they didn't know why they were fighting again. They're still fighting, and they just wanted the war to end. So therefore, with the French out of commission for a while, the Brits had to keep the pressure going on the Western Front. So as we can see from the Empire troops, such as the Canadians at Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge, the Australians at Hill 60, and all the gallant and brave fighting that's going on thanks to the British Empire, we see that Britain had to the British Empire had to single-handedly hold off the Germans, while the French were trying to heal their own wounds and try to solve the mutiny. Unfortunately, again, by 1917, 1.7 million Russians have been killed, 8 million have been wounded, and 2.5 million were prisoners. So the Russians, of course, were not happy. Inflation was high, the peasants were unhappy, they called up to war, they hoarded grain, the economy was going down the toilet, and people were angry because the Tsar still wanted them to fight. And so Tsar Nicholas II abdicated and Russia became a republic. Hooray! Unfortunately, it didn't become a republic for long because of the communists and socialists coming in, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk pulled Russia out of the war. Yeah, the provisional government decided to continue the war, but the war minister tried to launch an unsuccessful offensive in June 1917, and this of course made the Russians even more unhappy at the population. So as we can see, domestic issues in Russia worsened because, yeah, you have a bunch of poor people, your king is an idiot, well, not an idiot, but he's a jingoistic guy, and then you're fighting for a lost cause and everybody dies, so it's not that good, and also you're poor. Anyway, Austria-Hungary had the major victory. If we go to the Italians, and between the Italians and Austro-Hungarians, the Austria-Hungary had a major victory at the Battle of Caporetto. And then they had a dramatic return to the war of movement, because by this time you have fresh troops and everything was, the political and battlefield climate was changing. You can now afford to not be dug down because the Russians were gone, and the Allies, the Germans, were trying to race and push forward as hard as they could. No use getting dug in when a massive force is steamrolling towards you. They called Blackadder. Suddenly, 4.5 million heavily armored Germans hovered over the horizon, and I was terrified. So anyway, the Germans had a massive breakthrough during the 100 Days Offensive, when they had to put all of their forces for a last-ditch offensive, and the Allies had a massive counterattack thanks to the Americans, which resulted in surrender. Anyway, I should have put this bit at the end because, yeah. Anyway, the Russians signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, as I've said, and they surrendered, and not surrendered, but they agreed not to fight. And then they gave land to Germany, and they just went away and went to establish their own USSR later. General Ludendorff launched a massive attack that was strengthened by troops on the Russian front, because now that the Russians were gone, they could afford to push their troops back to the western front to help against the Allied offensives, because Germany was no longer fighting a war on two fronts. Unfortunately, this depletion and war of attrition for a couple of years on two fronts had weakened Germany so much that it's no longer possible. Germany had no further reserves. They were all gone. So Ludendorff had created, during this time, German engineering. They had the MP-18 for the storm battalions, the storm troops, and flamethrowers. So they were very, very... as I've said in my first video before, they were very, very effective because their job was to storm trenches with handheld portable automatic fire from the MP-18s, the submachine guns, and to clear trenches with the automatic fire and potentially the flamethrowers, which were deadly. No one wants to get caught in a jet of flame, so yeah, the storm troops are pretty effective for their time. The Germans inflicted heavy casualties, as they said, and advanced forward 65 kilometers in 5 days. That's that's one of the biggest gains they've made since the start of the war. And by July, the Germans were once again very close to Paris, 40 miles. But unfortunately, the Germans lost a lot of troops in the breakthrough, and by this time the forces were tired and overstretched by the rapid advance. Again, they didn't learn from the Schlieffen Plan, wait for the railheads, wait for the supplies, and fight carefully. They just had to rush because they were desperate. But it's understandable, because very soon not US troops are backed by US. Sorry, the Allied troops were backed up by US troops. The Americans were finally in the war. The Allies launched a counterattack on the 8th of August, and by this time technology had improved a lot, as we see again. If you play Battlefield 1, it says, again, don't use Battlefield 1 as history, but it's a kind of an interesting insight into so-called the mobility side of the First World War. Combined arms, as I've said in my first video, radio, tanks, and artillery were all coordinated together. No longer were the different separate services fighting as an independent unit, but they were all cohesive, and they all worked together to try and take down the Germans. So it was a pretty substantial improvement, and it was, as I've said before, the dawn of modern warfare, because at last you have a orchestrated and well cohesive and well thought out offensive with armored warfare, light infantry, heavy infantry, tanks, and heavy artillery and light artillery. It's pretty impressive. And by September, the Allies had taken the land back taken by Germany and broke the Hindenburg line. It's a pretty big offensive. Once you break the Hindenburg line, because it was a series of lines of offensives set up, line of defensives, like such with cannons and whatnot, set up by Hindenburg. And by the end of the month, they were advancing well on the way and just beating back a tired and defeated German army. The Germans soon, on the 6th of October, the German government had approached for armistice because it was time. They couldn't fight anymore. We wanted to stop. November the 9th, the Kaiser fled to Holland, and the new socialist government, the Weimar Republic, signed a ceasefire 2 days later, and they signed peace on the 11th of November 1918. 11/11, so it's Remembrance Day as we now know it. Ooh, that was a mouthful. But anyway, I didn't touch much on the Italians and Austro-Hungarians, unfortunately, but I've tried to cover as much as I can on you will mostly study about what is happening on the European continent, such as the Western Front, a bit of the Eastern Front, and some parts in the Middle East, like Gallipoli and stuff. I didn't cover much on the desert, unfortunately. I didn't cover much in Japan because Japan only did Qingdao and garrisoned most of the British agreements in the East. And yeah, that's basically similar to First World War. And you think of it this way as a general rule: everybody on the Western Front between 1914 and 1917 was trench warfare. Europe was trench warfare. The Middle East was semi-trench warfare with a lot of skirmishes here and there. And anywhere else, you're just basically garrisoning and just fighting skirmishes in the desert and whatnot. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope I've taught you something or kind of gone through something with you. And yeah, I'm actually talking a lot. I'm actually a bit tired now. So I'll see you guys next time. And yeah, I think next time I'm gonna go back to a proper talking with notes about the technology of the First World War. Anyway, I'm actually tired. So I'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Peace.